What's up, dudes and dudettes? Today I'm going to show you how to make a snuggly soft blanket with quilting cotton on one side and Minky on the other. It's fall here in Michigan, it's starting to get chilly at night. Who doesn't need a super soft blanket to curl up in? You'll notice I have a distinct Halloween theme going on here. Of course, you can choose whatever fabrics you want. I think it would be fun to do a Christmas themed blanket, or maybe make a bunch of Christmas themed blankets and give them out as gifts for the holidays. Or just skip the holiday theme altogether and just pick a pretty quilting cotton you like. The backing of my blanket, as I mentioned before, is Minky. It's a super soft fabric that's kind of like a short pile fur, had a baby with fleece. It's really common in baby blankets, which by the way is another good use for this blanket, baby showers. Anyway, you can easily switch out the Minky for fleece or chenille or Sherpa fabric. Anything thick and soft should make this a nice warm blanket. Onward!
Alright, time to talk measurements. I wanted a gigantic behemoth of a blanket that I could curl up in when it gets really chilly in the winter time. That's part of the reason I did the patchwork top with the 4 different fabrics. I wanted to use the full width of the Minky, which is 60 inches. You aren't going to find many quilting cottons, at least not cool ones, in that width. But the bonus is also that I got to pick 4 fabrics instead of 1. Haha! To simplify things a little bit, I bought 2 yards of Minky and went with that as my overall blanket size. So it's going to be approximately 60 inches by 72 inches. It's not really a standard blanket size, but so what. For my top fabrics, I bought 1 yard of each. Further into the tutorial, I'll show you the best way to cut down each piece to a rectangle that measures 31 inches by 36 inches. If you're okay with a smaller blanket, especially if you're making one for a baby or a child, you can absolutely get away with a single quilting cotton on top, and it'll save you a little bit of money and a little bit of time since you won't have to piece the top together. The standard size for a receiving blanket is traditionally 40 inches by 40 inches, and since most quilting cottons are 44 inches wide, that's pretty much perfect. Another option would be a toddler size blanket, which is more like 40 inches by 60 inches. The size tends to vary a little bit on that one. So that would be another good size to go with if you only want a single fabric for the top. On to the first official step. Pre-wash your fabrics. A lot of people suggest trimming the raw edges with pinking shears, but honestly, I still get a fair amount of unraveling even with that method. So I opt to serge the raw edges. If you don't have a serger, you can stitch about 1/4 or even 1/8 of an inch from the edge, and that should keep the unraveling to a minimum. Once everything is washed and dried, remove the stitches. I was so lazy I just serged this when it was still folded the way I bought it. That's just how I roll. Since we're doing some patchwork, straight edges and perfectly square corners are a must. The way to ensure that is to rip the fabric along the grain. So snip into your fabric about 1/2 inch from the edge, and then rip it. Rip it good. Anyway. Between the pre-washing and the ripping, we're probably still going to lose 1 inch or 2 of fabric. For this reason, if you're shooting for a very specific sized blanket, it's a smart idea to buy a few inches extra. So I'm being loose with my measurements. My blanket will turn out roughly 60 inches by 72 inches, like I said before. I'm perfectly fine if it's not spot on. Rip both raw edges along the grain for all of the woven fabrics. Note that I said woven fabrics. Do not try to rip the Minky. Not unless you want something like this to happen. Yeah. See, I didn't know if you could rip Minky. I know you can rip faux fur. And instead of looking it up, I decided to give it a whirl because I'm ballsy like that. Well, this is what being ballsy gets you. Luckily, I had some extra Minky left over from a different project, and I just patched the 2 together. It's a different color, but it'll give my blanket a little extra accidental detail. And anyway, we're going to leave cutting the Minky down until we have a finished size for the blanket top. So set the Minky aside for now. Once you've got the edges of your quilting cottons squared up, it's time to press. Yes, I'm being a good little seamstress today and using my iron, as much as I loathe it. Again, we're pressing the quilting fabric, but not the Minky. Now that everything is squared up and pressed flat, we're going to start cutting the quilting cotton down to size. I'm folding my fabric in half, because it's easier to cut that way, especially if you're using a rotary cutter. I'll start by trimming off one side of the selvages, and then I'll measure out 31 inches in width. On your marks, get set, cut! Set the scraps aside for some later projects. Rinse and repeat for the 4 pieces of quilting cotton. I generally have this decided beforehand. I spent a long time narrowing down these fabrics from about 50 different Halloween prints that I liked, so I pretty much know what's going where. But it never hurts to lay things out one last time to decide if that's really how you want it. Starting with the top 2 panels, slap them right sides together, line up the corners, and pin. Make sure the fabrics are oriented how you want, i.e., nothing is upside down that shouldn't be. Now we're going to sew one long, straight, half-inch seam. If you end up with a little unevenness at the bottom of the seam, just snip the longer edge with your scissors and rip to even things up. Press the seam open with your iron, and repeat this with the bottom 2 fabrics. Right sides together, pin, sew with a half-inch seam allowance, even up the bottom edge if necessary, and press the seam open. Now we're going to line up the 2 blocks. The key here is to line the center seam up just right when we're pinning. Since we really want the line to match up, it's best to start pinning here and move out the edges. So slap these right sides together and start pinning. Just like before, stitch with a half-inch seam allowance and then press the seam open. If we did everything just right, that center seam should match up just about perfectly. Huzzah! Now it's time to face the Minky. If your Minky came with a raggedy-ass edge like this, you'll need to do a little trim work. Mine has these handy little dots, which means I can just follow along with one of the dotted lines to keep my cut line straight. And here's where I do the pro move of totally blocking the camera with my arm. Nice! Otherwise, I'd suggest folding it in half, selvage to selvage, and trimming it as straight as possible. Again, a rotary cutter is always helpful for this kind of thing, because you can get a perfectly straight line at a perfect 90-degree angle from the selvage. I'm going to leave the other raw end of the Minky as is for now. Mark the center of your freshly cut edge of Minky, and line this up with the center of the woven blanket top, right sides together. Pin from the center out to the edges, and you can see here where I patched the Minky I ripped earlier. Notice I'm pinning with the Minky on the bottom. Minky is fairly stretchy, and I think it's a little easier to keep the Minky laying flat and unstretched when it's on the bottom. If we measured everything right earlier and we have a nice, accurate seam allowance, then our woven top should be exactly lining up with the edges of the Minky. Time to pin down both sides, keeping the edges nice and even. Once we have the top and both sides pinned, we want to make sure all the layers are nice and flat and unwrinkled. If you have somewhere you can lay the whole blanket out flat, that's the easiest way. But for the sake of my video and for the open space deficient, I will show you a trick for keeping the layers flat when you're working on a table or a smaller work surface. Basically, we're going to roll the blanket up like a jelly roll, starting from the top pinned edge. As you roll, just keep making sure that everything remains flat and unwrinkled. Go slow and smush out any creases you come across. Once we reach the bottom unpinned edge, really make sure everything is laying flat and even. You could freeball this and cut it while we're laying flat, but I'm going to pin, sew with a half-inch seam allowance, and then I'm going to trim the excess from the edge after we're done sewing. So, sewing something this massive can be quite a chore, so here's a tip. Remember how we rolled the blanket up? Leave it rolled up. Sew along the bottom edge first, and then as you sew up one of the sides, unroll as you go. Here's a shot where you can kind of see the big roll of blanket in front of the machine as I sew. You'll still have 2 edges to sew with a big old massive blanket hanging out of the side of your machine. Just take your time and adjust everything to lay flat as you sew. Sew a few stitches, stop, readjust. Sew a few more stitches, stop, readjust, and so on. When you get to where you're sewing up the 4th and final edge, leave a nice 6 to 7 inch gap somewhere towards the middle. This is how you're going to turn the blanket right sides out. Just backstitch, skip over a section of the seam, pick a new starting point, backstitch again, and finish out your sewing. Once your sewing is finished, go through and remove all your pins now if you're a wild child that sews over them like me. People give me flack about that sometimes in the comments, but let me tell you something. Every professional seamstress I've ever met sews over pins like this. It's just faster. Have I hit a pin before? You're damn right, and I live to tell the tale. Now we'll finally trim off the excess Minky. This next step is me being extra. In other words, it's totally optional. If you want your blanket to have square edges, then you'll just clip the corners like so and skip to where we turn the blanket out. But if you want rounded corners, grab something nice and circular, like the patented What the Craft Circle Skirt Guide, and use it to trace out some rounded edges. Once you've marked the curved lines, pin along the marked lines to keep the fabric from shifting as you sew. Backstitch along the straight seam line, and then follow the marked curve. Once you get to the end, again, sew right over the previous seam line and backstitch. And then after stitching, trim the excess fabric from the corners. Now comes my favorite part. Find the gap you left in the seam, reach inside all the way down to the opposite end, grab a handful and pull. Keep pulling until the blanket is right sides out. Once you've got the whole blanket turned, make sure the corners are good and turned out. If you left your corners square, this goes double for you. You'll probably want to give the corners a few pokes with a chopstick or something like that to get them nice and sharp. Now we press. Honestly, you can probably get away with finger pressing, but I'm trying to set a good example for you guys. And pressing first does tend to give a crisper edge. Start by paying special attention to the gap we used for turning. Make sure the edges are turned in 1/2 inch to match our seam allowance. Press and pin. For the rest of the blanket, we can space the pins farther apart. You might be tempted to skip the pins since it's just top stitching. We've already sewn everything together. On a small project, I often do skip pinning when I top stitch, but for this big ol' floppy blanket, the layers can be unruly, and I find pinning helps keep all the layers where they should be while I sew. Once everything is pressed and pinned, we top stitch. I don't know why, but I think 2 rows of top stitching just looks right on a blanket, so that's what I did. I stitched about 1/8 of an inch from the edge all the way around, and then I did another row right next to that. I used the edge of my presser foot as the guide on that second row of stitching, so it's about 3/16 of an inch from the first line of top stitching. That's it. The blanket is finished and ready for snuggling.
Thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss my next tutorial. Leave a comment below, let me know how your blanket turned out. And be sure to visit whatthecraft.com for more crafty tips, tutorials, and kick-ass sewing patterns.